Anzio Beachhead, Italy, February the 4th, 1944, 3:40 in the morning. The German mortar rounds had been walking up the draw for 20 minutes before they found the aid station. They came in clusters of three, each one closer than the last, shaking the frozen mud loose from the canvas walls and sending instruments rattling across the steel trays. When the last round landed close enough to knock two of the three kerosene lanterns off their hooks and plunge the surgical tent into near darkness, the American surgeon, operating by the light of the single remaining flame, did not lift his hands from the wound. He told the orderly to hold the lantern steady. He asked the nurse for the clamp, and he kept cutting. The patient on the table was a 22-year-old private first class from Tupelo, Mississippi, named Earl Whitaker, who had already survived one wound in North Africa the previous spring and returned to the front. Shrapnel from an anti-personnel round had opened his abdominal cavity in 4 places. His systolic blood pressure on arrival had been barely palpable, a number so low that the medic who carried him in had already begun composing the letter to the boy's mother in his head. But hanging above that operating table, swaying gently each time the ground shook, was a glass bottle filled with dark red liquid. Whole human blood, not plasma, not saline, not a synthetic substitute. Whole blood drawn from the arm of a donor in the United States 6 weeks earlier, type tested for syphilis, refrigerated to between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius, sealed in a sterile glass container, shipped across the Atlantic Ocean by refrigerated transport, delivered to a medical depot in Naples, moved forward by refrigerated truck, to this tent in a ravine on an Italian beachhead, and hung on a metal stand above Earl Whitaker's chest before the surgeon made his first incision. Earl Whitaker lived. He was evacuated to a general hospital in Naples 4 days later. He went home to Mississippi in June. He married a woman named Clara from the next town over. He raised 3 children. He built furniture for a living. He died in 1987 at the age of 65 of causes entirely unrelated to the war that nearly killed him at 22. Every element of what saved him, the blood, the surgery, the evacuation system, the penicillin administered after the operation, had not existed as a military medical capability when the war began. All of it had been built in 30 months. But that is only half of the story. Because on the same night, 1,000 miles to the east, on the frozen plains near the Dnieper River in Ukraine, another surgeon stood over another table. A German surgeon, trained at one of the finest medical schools in the world. His hands just as steady, his knowledge just as deep, perhaps deeper. The wound in front of him was nearly identical. A young soldier, shrapnel to the abdomen, multiple perforations, massive blood loss. The German surgeon performed the same operation with the same precision. Every incision correct. Every suture placed with the confidence of a man trained in a tradition that had dominated world medicine for the better part of a century. His patient died. Not because the surgeon failed, not because German medicine was inferior, but because no one sent him the blood. Because the penicillin that could have stopped the infection existed only in theory in his world. Because the evacuation system that should have delivered that wounded man to his table within hours had instead taken 14, and in those 14 hours, bacteria had multiplied in the contaminated tissue, until the surgery, however technically perfect, was closing a door long after the fire had already consumed the house. This is not a story about 2 surgeons. This is a story about 2 systems. One that decided every private's life was worth the full industrial and scientific weight of the most productive economy on Earth, and one that did not. The distance between those 2 decisions would be measured in the oldest and most irreducible currency of war: the bodies of young men who had no say in being sent to die. To understand how 2 equally skilled surgeons arrived at such different outcomes on the same night, in February 1944, you have to go back 14 months, to a desert in North Africa, to a young American doctor who had never seen a man die on his table, and to the night that changed everything he believed about what it meant to be a surgeon. November 1942, Operation Torch, the coast of North Africa. Thomas Brennan was 29 years old when the United States Army put him on a transport ship and sent him to war. He had graduated from Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia in 1938, one of the oldest and most respected medical schools in America, a place where the hallways smelled of formaldehyde and ambition in equal measure. He had spent 3 years as a surgical resident at Philadelphia General Hospital, learning his craft under fluorescent lights in sterile rooms with running water and blood banks 3 floors below. He was not a brilliant surgeon. He would have been the first to admit it. He was careful, methodical, the kind of young doctor who checked his work twice and his sutures 3 times, who lay awake at night replaying operations in his head, searching for the moment where he could have been better. His supervising professor, an old man with hands like leather and eyes that missed nothing, had watched Brennan agonize for 45 minutes over a routine appendectomy one Tuesday afternoon and said to him afterward in the hallway, with the gentleness of a man delivering a truth that would take years to fully arrive, "Brennan, in this hospital, you have the luxury of time. Where you are going, time is the one thing they will not give you." Brennan did not understand that sentence in November 1942. He understood it by December. He arrived in North Africa attached to a battalion aid station with the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one of the most storied units in the American Army. The reality of battlefield medicine hit him on his first day with the force of a physical blow. The aid station was a canvas tent pitched on sand. There was no running water. There were no fluorescent lights. There was no blood bank 3 floors below. There was plasma, the liquid component of blood that could restore circulating volume, but could not carry oxygen to dying tissue. There were sulfonamide powder packets, a first-line antibiotic that worked sometimes and sometimes did not. There were dressings that ran out by mid-afternoon. There were kerosene lanterns that attracted insects in clouds so thick the orderlies tied netting over the surgical field. The smell was what Brennan would remember most. Sand mixed with blood, mixed with diesel fuel, mixed with the particular sweetness of infection that no amount of medical training can prepare you for until you breathe it in the first time and understand that smell is a living thing, a colony of bacteria announcing its presence through chemistry. His first patient arrived on a stretcher carried by 2 men whose faces he would never remember. The patient he would never forget. Corporal James Doyle, 19 years old, from Brooklyn, New York. Everyone called him Jimmy. He had been hit by artillery fragments during a skirmish near Kasserine Pass in February 1943, one of the first major engagements between American and German forces in North Africa, and one of the most humiliating American defeats of the war. The fragments had torn through Doyle's abdomen in 3 places. He had been carried for 2 hours across open desert before reaching the aid station. By the time Brennan cut away the uniform and looked at the wound, Doyle's skin was the color of wet cement and his pulse was a whisper. Brennan knew what to do. He had trained for this. Open the abdomen, find the perforations, repair them, lavage the cavity, close. He had done it in Philadelphia on patients who had been stabbed or shot or thrown through windshields. The technique was the same. The wound was repairable, but Doyle had lost too much blood. His body was shutting down organ by organ as the circulating volume dropped below the threshold that sustained consciousness and function in life. Brennan needed whole blood, not plasma. Whole blood with the red cells that carry oxygen to tissue, that keep the brain alive, that give a surgeon time to work. He did not have it. Whole blood in forward positions in North Africa in February 1943 was not yet part of the supply chain. It existed in rear hospitals. It existed in theory. It did not exist in a canvas tent on the sand. Brennan transfused plasma. He operated. His hands were steady. His technique was flawless. Every suture placed with the precision of a man who had checked his work twice and his sutures 3 times in Philadelphia. But plasma was not enough. The volume returned, the oxygen did not. Doyle's blood pressure stabilized for 20 minutes and then began to fall again slowly, inevitably, like a tide going out on a beach where nothing could hold it. Jimmy Doyle died on the operating table at 4 in the morning, 7 hours after being hit, 19 years old. A boy from Brooklyn whose face still had acne and whose breast pocket contained a letter from his mother asking him if he was eating enough. Brennan stood over the body for a long time. The orderlies waited. Nurse Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan, 26 from Boston, who had been holding retractors for the past 2 hours, stood with her hands at her sides and did not speak. There was nothing to say. Everyone in the tent knew what had happened. Everyone knew why. Brennan picked up his surgical notebook. He wrote in the small, precise handwriting that his professors in Philadelphia would have recognized: surgical technique adequate, wound repairable, patient died of hemorrhagic shock secondary to inadequate blood replacement, plasma insufficient for this degree of hemorrhage, whole blood required, whole blood unavailable. Then he added a line that was not medical, a line that he would carry for the rest of his life and repeat to every class of medical students he ever taught. I did everything right. He died anyway. Not because I failed, because the system behind me did not exist yet. That sentence is the thesis of this entire story. It is the sentence that separates individual excellence from systemic capacity. A brilliant surgeon in a broken system will lose patients that a competent surgeon in a working system will save. The question is not whether the doctor is good enough. The question is whether everything behind the doctor is good enough. The blood, the drugs, the transport, the time. But the blood that could have saved Jimmy Doyle's life was not impossible. It was not science fiction. At that very moment in a Red Cross donation center in Cincinnati, Ohio, a woman named Ruth Ann Perkins was rolling up her sleeve. She was 34 years old. Her husband was serving in the Pacific. She had 2 children at home. Every 8 weeks, she came to the center and gave a pint of blood. She did not know whose life it would save. She did not know that the system to deliver it to a surgeon's hands on a battlefield did not yet fully exist. But it was being built. And the story of how it was built is the story of the most consequential and least commemorated achievement of the Second World War. If you believe that stories like this, stories about the men and women who built the systems that saved lives, deserve to be told, subscribe now. Because what happens next will change your understanding of what America built in 30 months. 1,000 miles east of where Thomas Brennan stood over Jimmy Doyle's body, a different surgeon was learning the same lesson. But his version would cost far more. Because unlike Thomas Brennan, Friedrich Vogt would never get the system he needed. Friedrich Vogt was 31 years old in the winter of 1943, and he carried his training like a coat of arms. He had graduated from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, one of the most distinguished medical schools in Europe, an institution whose faculty had included Nobel laureates, and whose surgical tradition was taught in hospitals from Edinburgh to Baltimore. German medicine in the early 20th century had produced Robert Koch, the father of bacteriology, Paul Ehrlich, the founder of chemotherapy, Wilhelm Röntgen, the discoverer of diagnostic radiology. German pharmaceutical science had given the world aspirin, sulfonamide antibiotics, and the foundational research on anesthesia. When Friedrich Vogt arrived at the Eastern Front in 1941, he carried this institutional heritage with him, and he carried it with the justified pride of a man who understood that his training placed him at the apex of the world's medical knowledge. What Vogt also carried, though he did not yet recognize it as a liability, was a belief. A belief that had been woven into every year of his training, reinforced by every professor, confirmed by every successful surgery in the clean, well-lit operating theaters of Munich. The belief that a surgeon's hands were his system, that individual excellence was sufficient, that skill applied with enough determination could overcome any obstacle. He said it to the junior surgeons who served under him in the tone of a man stating an obvious truth. A surgeon's hands are his system. Fix what is in front of you. Adapt. That is what German medicine has always done. His superior, Dr. Heinrich Lanzer, 52 years old, a veteran of the medical corps in the First World War, agreed. Lanzer had survived Verdun with less. He had operated on wooden tables in trenches with no anesthesia and no light beyond what a candle provided, and his patients had lived some of them, enough of them, and he regarded the complaints of younger surgeons about supply shortages as evidence of softness rather than legitimate concern. We survived Verdun with less, Lanzer told Vogt when Vogt raised the issue of blood supply in their weekly meeting. German surgeons adapt. That is what makes us German. The Eastern Front in the winter of 1942 and 1943 broke that belief the way a stone breaks glass. Not all at once, crack by crack, patient by patient, death by preventable death. Vogt served at a Feld lazaret near Stalingrad during the months of the siege, one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The casualties were relentless. The supplies were not. Bandages were washed and reused after crude sterilization because fresh ones had not arrived. Anesthesia was rationed so severely that some procedures were performed with captured Soviet vodka as the only available sedative. Blood plasma ran out regularly. Whole blood transfusion required a compatible donor physically present at the point of need, which meant relying on the kind of luck that a wounded man on a collapsing front in January 1943 could not reasonably expect. The cold was something Vogt had not been prepared for. Munich had cold winters certainly, but Munich's cold was the cold of a city. It was the cold you walk through between heated buildings. The cold of the Eastern Front was a different category of experience. It was the cold that turned blood to slush in collection bottles. The cold that made rubber tubing brittle so that it cracked when you tried to bend it for a transfusion. The cold that froze morphine in the syrettes so that you had to hold them in your armpit for 10 minutes before the drug would flow. The cold that turned a man's fingers white at the tips if he removed his gloves for longer than it took to thread a suture, which was precisely what surgery required. Vogt's first winter patient at Stalingrad, before the siege even closed its ring around the city, was a man named Schütze Karl Hessler. Private Hessler was 18 years old from a village in the Rhineland drafted 6 months earlier and sent east with a replacement battalion that had received 4 weeks of training before deployment. He had been shot through the left thigh. The bullet had shattered the femur and nicked the femoral artery. By the time 2 of his squad mates dragged him across 300 meters of frozen rubble to the aid post, and by the time the aid post sent him by horse-drawn cart to the Feldlazaret, because the ambulance had broken down 2 days earlier and the replacement parts had not arrived, Hessler had been bleeding for 6 hours. Vogt could see from across the room that the boy was in hemorrhagic shock. The skin gray, the breathing shallow and rapid, the pulse barely present at the wrist. This was a wound that required immediate surgery, immediate blood transfusion, and immediate stabilization. In Munich, this boy would have been in an operating theater within 30 minutes of arrival. He would have had 2 units of typed cross-matched whole blood hanging above him before the anesthesia took effect. He would have had penicillin waiting for him in recovery. He would have lived. Vogt was certain of this with the absolute certainty of a man who had performed this exact operation in those exact conditions and watched the patient walk out of the hospital 3 weeks later. At the Feldlazaret near Stalingrad, Vogt had none of it. He had plasma. He had his instruments, which were still good. He had an operating table, which was a wooden door laid across 2 sawhorses. He had light from a kerosene lantern because the generator had run out of fuel the previous evening, and the fuel truck was somewhere on a road between Kalach and the front, possibly destroyed, possibly delayed. No one knew. He operated on Hessler by lamplight. He found the arterial damage and repaired it. He set the femur as best he could without proper orthopedic equipment. He transfused plasma. The boy's volume came up. His color did not. Because plasma carries no oxygen, and Hessler's remaining red blood cells were not enough to sustain the demand of a body in crisis. Vogt needed whole blood. He called for a donor. The orderly went through the facility asking every conscious man for his blood type. 2 men matched. One was too weak from his own wounds to donate. The other agreed. The direct transfusion worked partially. Hessler stabilized. His pulse grew stronger. But the wound had been open and contaminated for 6 hours in conditions that turned every wound into a bacterial incubator. Vogt applied sulfonamide directly to the wound bed and administered it orally. He knew it was not enough for this level of contamination. He knew that penicillin, the drug he had read about in the Lancet in the British Medical Journal, the drug that researchers at Oxford had shown, could eliminate wound infections that sulfonamide only slowed would have changed the outcome. He also knew that penicillin was not coming. Karl Hessler developed gas gangrene 4 days later. The infection spread up the damaged tissue of his thigh with the speed that Clostridium perfringens achieves in anaerobic conditions, which is to say the speed of a fire in dry grass. Vogt amputated the leg above the knee in an attempt to stay ahead of the infection. The amputation bought 3 days. The infection appeared in the stump. Vogt operated again, cutting higher. The infection appeared again. There was nowhere left to cut. Karl Hessler died on the 12th day, 18 years old, from the Rhineland. His mother would receive the notification 8 weeks later, along with his personal effects, which consisted of a comb, a photograph of a girl named Ilse, and a letter he had started but never finished. The letter began, "Dear Mother, it is cold here, but I am." The sentence had no ending. Perhaps he had been interrupted. Perhaps he had not known what to write after the word am. Vogt recorded the case in his surgical log. Cause of death, gas gangrene, secondary to contaminated wound. Contributing factors, delayed evacuation, inadequate blood supply, absence of penicillin. He wrote it in the clinical language of a physician documenting a medical outcome. What he felt the particular rage of a trained professional who knows exactly what was needed and did not have it, he kept to himself. Lanzer would have called it softness, but Hessler's death was only the first crack. The siege of Stalingrad closed its ring in November 1942, and inside that ring approximately 300,000 German soldiers were trapped. The Feldlazaret received casualties from the fighting inside the pocket at rates that exceeded its capacity by a factor of 3. Vogt operated on tables arranged in rows in a basement that had once been a school gymnasium. The wounded lay on the floor in the corridors waiting. Some waited for hours, some waited overnight. Some stopped waiting because they died on the floor, tended by orderlies who had no medicine to give them and no space to put them. The smell in that basement was something Vogt would carry for the rest of his life. Blood and unwashed bodies, an infection, and the particular sour smell of men who had not eaten properly in weeks and whose bodies were beginning to consume themselves. The temperature in the operating area never rose above 5 degrees Celsius. Vogt operated with his coat on. His breath was visible in the lamplight. The blood on his gloves cooled to room temperature so quickly that his hands were perpetually cold and wet, and the sensation of cold, wet gloves inside an open wound became the defining tactile memory of his war. He lost a boy named Gefreiter Willy Pelzer on Christmas Eve, 1942. Pelzer was 20 years old from Hamburg, a mechanic's apprentice before the war hit in the abdomen by shrapnel from a Soviet mortar. The wound was nearly identical to the one Thomas Brennan would see on Jimmy Doyle 2 months later in North Africa. Multiple perforations, peritoneal contamination, massive blood loss. Vogt operated. He repaired the perforations. He lavaged the cavity with saline that was so cold it had to be warmed on a kerosene stove before use, and even then it was barely above freezing. He had no blood of any kind. The plasma had been exhausted 3 days earlier. He had no donor. Every man in the facility who was capable of donating was either unconscious, exsanguinated, or dead. Pelzer survived the surgery. His heart kept beating. His lungs kept breathing. But without blood to carry oxygen to his organs, the boy's body was running on fumes. Vogt sat beside him through the night, checking his pulse every 15 minutes, adjusting the single blanket that was all they had, talking to him in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, because Vogt had read somewhere that the sound of a human voice helped patients in shock maintain consciousness, and because there was nothing else he could do. Pelzer died at 4 in the morning on Christmas Day. The last thing he said was a name. Ilse. A different Ilse, or perhaps the same one. There were many Ilses in Germany in 1942. After Pelzer, something changed in Vogt's relationship with Lanzer. Vogt had reported Hessler's death and the contributing factors in clinical terms. He had reported 3 other preventable deaths in the same format. Lanzer had read each report, nodded, and filed it. After Pelzer, Vogt did not file a report. He went to Lanzer's quarters, which were a corner of the same basement separated by a hanging blanket, and he stood there until Lanzer looked up from the letter he was writing. "I need blood," Vogt said, "not plasma. Whole blood. I need a collection system. I need refrigeration. I need a supply chain that delivers typed, tested blood to this facility before the patients on my table bleed to death while I watch." Lanzer put down his pen. He looked at Vogt with the patience of a man who had heard this request before, not from Vogt specifically, but from the cumulative voice of every young surgeon who had not yet learned the lesson that Lanzer considered the most important lesson of military medicine. The lesson that you work with what you have. "I will forward your request," Lanzer said. "In the meantime, do what German surgeons have always done. Adapt," Vogt said. The word tasted like ash. "Yes," Lanzer said. "Adapt." Vogt returned to the operating room. He adapted. He operated on the next patient, and the next, and the next. He adapted to the cold, in the dark, in the absence of blood, in the absence of penicillin, in the 14-hour delays, in the reused bandages, in the rationed anesthesia. He adapted the way a man adapts to drowning, which is to say he kept moving his arms because the alternative was to stop. But the revelation that fully shattered Vogt's belief did not come at Stalingrad. It came afterward, in March 1943, after the surrender that Germany tried not to call a surrender after the remnants of the Sixth Army walked into Soviet captivity, and the Wehrmacht began its long retreat westward. Vogt was transferred to a new Feldlazaret near Kharkov. He arrived expecting improvement. Surely after 300,000 men had been lost in a pocket where the medical system had collapsed entirely, someone in the high command had acted. He met a transport officer at the new facility, a tired man with a permanent cough who had previously served under Professor Ferdinand Sauerbruch, the most celebrated surgeon in Germany. Sauerbruch had pioneered thoracic surgery techniques that were taught worldwide. He had visited the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942, had seen what Vogt had seen. He had written a report to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Acknowledged, the transport officer said. Acknowledged and filed, which in this army is the same as forgotten. Nothing changed. The supplies did not come. Germany had entered the war expecting blitzkrieg. The medical system was designed for a war that ended quickly. When the war became a grinding contest of attrition, the system was not rebuilt. It was expected to cope, and the men inside it were expected to adapt. And the patients on the tables were expected to die quietly in numbers that the high command factored into its projections as a fixed cost of operations. Vogt stood in the muddy corridor of the Feld Lazaret near Kharkov and understood. Not anger, something colder than anger, the recognition that the system would not come. Not this year, not ever. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the system that Friedrich Vogt would never receive was growing at a pace that would have seemed like fantasy to any military planner in 1918. Colonel Douglas Kendrick was building the Army Blood Program. Under his direction, the American Red Cross had established donor centers across the United States, eventually recruiting over 6 million Americans who gave blood specifically for the military. The blood was typed, tested, bottled in sterile glass containers, refrigerated, and shipped by air and sea to theater-level depots worldwide. The cold chain required coordination between the Red Cross, the Army Medical Department, the Army Transportation Corps, and the Air Transport Command that had no peacetime precedent. In Cincinnati, Ruth Ann Perkins finished her donation, pressed the cotton ball to her elbow, and walked into the Tuesday morning sunlight. She would never learn the name of the soldier her blood would save. She did not need to. That was the point of the system. It did not require heroism from any individual. It required participation. Millions of small acts, each ordinary, connected by logistics into something extraordinary. But blood was only the first weapon. There was a second, and the story of how it came to exist is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of American industry. In the summer of 1941, a quiet Australian pathologist named Howard Florey boarded a plane from England to the United States. He carried in the lining of his coat a substance more powerful than any weapon that would be deployed in the war. Spores of a mold called Penicillium notatum, the biological source of a compound that could kill bacteria inside the human body without killing the human. He had placed them there deliberately so that if his luggage were lost, the most important medical cargo of the 20th century would survive on his person. Florey was not a dramatic man. He was a bench scientist, an Australian who had spent years at Oxford University alongside Ernst Chain, a German refugee biochemist who had fled the Nazi regime because he was Jewish, and whose expertise in enzyme chemistry proved essential to isolating the active compound. Together, Florey and Chain had done what Alexander Fleming, who first noticed penicillin's antibacterial properties in a London laboratory in 1928, had never pursued. They had purified it, tested it on mice, tested it on human patients, and watched as infections that had been considered death sentences dissolved within days. The clinical results were extraordinary. Wound infections that had killed soldiers in every war since gunpowder responded to penicillin as if a switch had been turned off. Septicemia, gas gangrene, pneumonia, conditions that every army on Earth accepted as a fixed cost of combat were yielding to a drug that in documented cases transformed patients from dying to walking within 72 hours. The problem was production. Florey's Oxford team was growing penicillin in bedpans and milk churns. The quantities were absurdly small. To treat a single patient required the output of dozens of containers cultivated over weeks. To treat the number of patients that a military campaign would produce required quantities that Florey's entire laboratory working at maximum capacity for a year could not approach. The British pharmaceutical industry, strained to breaking by wartime demands, could not scale to military volumes. Florey needed America. Specifically, he needed American manufacturing. The capacity to take a laboratory curiosity and turn it into a mass-produced pharmaceutical product in the middle of a global war. He arrived in the United States in the summer of 1941, carrying a desperation that he concealed behind the composed demeanor of a man trained in the British academic tradition of understating everything. He had tried to interest British industry. He had been told that resources were committed elsewhere. He had been told that the quantities he described were impractical. He had been told politely and repeatedly that the war effort could not spare the industrial capacity required for a drug that had been tested on fewer than a dozen patients. What Flory had and what he brought to America was data, clinical data, patient records showing infections that were uniformly fatal, responding to treatment within days. Photographs of wounds that would have produced gas gangrene in every previous war, healing cleanly under penicillin therapy. And the spores themselves, the living culture from which the drug could be produced if someone somewhere could solve the problem of producing it in quantities larger than what fit in a bedpan. The meeting took place in New York in the offices of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Representatives from Merck, Pfizer, Squibb, and Lederle sat across from the quiet Australian. Four pharmaceutical companies that had competed against each other for decades, that had guarded their proprietary processes and their market positions with the ferocity of any American corporation, were being asked to share, to pool their technical knowledge, to treat the production of penicillin not as a commercial opportunity, but as a national engineering challenge. The man who brokered this agreement was Dr. Robert Coghill of the United States Department of Agriculture's Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois. Coghill had been studying fermentation processes for industrial applications. He understood molds, he understood scaling, and he understood that the problem Flory was describing was not a medical problem. It was an engineering problem. The mold worked, the drug worked. What did not work was the method of producing it in quantities that mattered. The pharmaceutical companies agreed to cooperate, not out of altruism alone, though some of the men in that room had sons in uniform and understood viscerally what was at stake. They agreed because the government made clear this was a wartime priority coordinated by the War Production Board, and because the drug Flory described could save soldiers in numbers that no other medical intervention in history had approached. What followed was a demonstration of American industrial capability that remains one of the most remarkable manufacturing achievements of the 20th century. And at its center was a problem that seemed simple to describe and proved enormously difficult to solve. Penicillin grows naturally on the surface of nutrient media. In Flory's Oxford laboratory, the mold was cultivated on the surface of shallow trays filled with a nutrient broth. The mold formed a thin mat on the surface, and the penicillin it produced diffused into the liquid below, from which it was extracted through a painstaking process of filtration and purification. The yield was tiny. Each tray produced enough penicillin for perhaps a fraction of a single patient's course of treatment. To treat one patient fully required dozens of trays cultivated over weeks. To treat the anticipated casualties of a major military campaign would have required millions of trays occupying warehouses the size of aircraft hangars, tended by an army of technicians producing a fraction of what was needed. At Pfizer's laboratory in Brooklyn, New York, a microbiologist named Jasper Kane looked at this problem and saw it for what it was. Not a biology problem, a geometry problem. The mold grew on surfaces. Surfaces are two-dimensional. If you want more surface, you need more trays. But if you could get the mold to grow in 3 dimensions, submerged in liquid, in deep tanks instead of on shallow trays, the yield would increase not linearly, but by orders of magnitude. The idea was simple. The execution was a nightmare. Penicillium notatum had evolved over millions of years to grow on surfaces. It was an aerobic organism. It needed oxygen. On the surface of a tray, oxygen was freely available from the air above. In a deep tank submerged in liquid, the mold had no access to air. It needed to be provided with oxygen artificially through aeration, and the aeration had to be precisely controlled. Too little oxygen and the mold died. Too much agitation and the delicate fungal filaments were sheared apart, killing the culture. The temperature had to be maintained within a narrow range. The nutrient broth had to be formulated to support growth in conditions the organism had never encountered in nature. And contamination, the introduction of unwanted bacteria or competing molds, had to be prevented in vessels that were far larger and more complex than any laboratory, flask vessels that had valves and pipes and agitators and sampling ports, each one a potential entry point for contaminants that would destroy an entire batch. Kane and his team at Pfizer attacked the problem with the systematic determination that characterized American industrial problem-solving at its best. They built experimental fermentation tanks. They tested aeration rates. They experimented with nutrient formulations. They developed methods to sterilize the tanks and all their components to prevent contamination. They worked in shifts that ran through the night because the fermentation process did not pause for human schedules, and because every week of delay was measured in wound infections on battlefields that would not wait either. The first attempts failed. The mold died. The cultures contaminated. The yields were lower than the surface method, not higher because the conditions were wrong, and no one yet knew what the right conditions were. There was a period of weeks in early 1943 when it appeared that deep tank fermentation might be a dead end, that the mold simply could not be persuaded to grow submerged in quantities that justified the engineering investment. Kane did not stop. He adjusted the aeration. He modified the nutrient broth, adding corn, steep liquor, a waste product from corn processing, that Coghill's team in Peoria had discovered dramatically increased penicillin yield. He found a strain of the mold isolated from a cantaloupe purchased at a market in Peoria that produced far more penicillin than Fleming's original strain. He redesigned the agitation system to provide oxygen without destroying the culture. And by the late summer of 1943, deep tank fermentation was working. Not just working at a scale that transformed the economics of penicillin production from artisanal to industrial. A single deep tank could produce more penicillin in a week than Florey's entire Oxford laboratory could produce in a year. Pfizer converted an old ice plant in Brooklyn into a penicillin production facility. Other companies followed. Merck scaled up, Squibb scaled up, Lederle scaled up. The government coordinated sharing technical data between competitors under the authority of the War Production Board. American penicillin production in 1943 was approximately 21 billion units. In 1944, it was approximately 1.6 trillion units, a 75-fold increase in a single year. By D-Day, sufficient penicillin existed to treat every anticipated Allied casualty from the Normandy invasion. Every private, every corporal, every rifleman who stepped onto those beaches carried a sulfonamide powder packet in his first aid kit. Behind him in the field hospitals, penicillin was available as standard post-operative medication. Germany had penicillin in precisely the way a country has a thing when it has discovered its existence and produced it in quantities sufficient for a few patients in a few hospitals. Bayer, Hoechst, and Schering had the chemical knowledge. They lacked deep tank fermentation technology, a coordinated production program, the industrial infrastructure to scale in months rather than years, and the supply chain to move the product to where it was needed. German production in 1944 reached somewhere between 3 and 5 billion units, less than 1/3 of 1% of American output. A German private wounded on the Eastern Front had a statistical probability of receiving penicillin that approached zero, the drug that could have saved Karl Hessler from gas gangrene, the drug that could have saved Willy Pelzer on Christmas Eve, the drug that Friedrich Vogt knew existed and knew worked and knew was not coming. It was being produced in a converted ice plant in Brooklyn by a microbiologist who had never seen a battlefield and never would, and it was saving the lives of American privates and corporals and riflemen who would never know his name. That is what systems do. They connect the microbiologist to the battlefield, the donor to the surgeon, the factory to the tent. No single person in the chain is heroic. The chain itself is the achievement. Thomas Brennan did not know these production numbers in November 1943. He knew only that penicillin had arrived at his field hospital in Italy in small quantities and that it worked. He had watched wound infections that would have killed Jimmy Doyle dissolve under treatment as if they had never existed. He was stationed now with a field hospital attached to the Fifth Army in Italy in the grinding campaign up the peninsula. The system was improving every week. Whole blood arrived more regularly. Penicillin was limited but present. And then on a cold November night after a battle near the Volturno River, the system delivered to Thomas Brennan a problem that no doctrine had prepared him for, in a face he had not expected to see again. But first, the night that taught Brennan the difference between a system's limits and a system's verdict. By March 1943, the American medical system in North Africa was improving. Whole blood had begun arriving at forward positions in small quantities. Not enough for every patient, but enough to make the calculus of triage even more agonizing, because now there was sometimes just enough to save one man out of three. Brennan had been transferred to a clearing company. He had performed dozens of surgeries since Doyle's death. He had learned to operate faster, decide sooner, waste less time on the second guessing that his professor in Philadelphia would have recognized. And on a night in late March after a sharp engagement near El Guitar time was not the problem. Blood was. Three casualties arrived within minutes of each other. All three had abdominal wounds. All three were losing blood faster than plasma could replace. All three would die without whole blood. Brennan had one bottle. The first was Private First Class Earl Whitaker, 22 from Tupelo, Mississippi. 4 shrapnel perforations. The second was Sergeant Robert Callahan, 24 from Cincinnati, a combat medic who had carried 2 other wounded men to safety before collapsing from his own injuries. The third was a German soldier captured during the engagement, approximately 20 years old, wearing a uniform soaked in blood. Sullivan stood beside Brennan with a single bottle of blood waiting for his decision. At the entrance to the tent, a figure appeared. Colonel Raymond Hargrove, 48 years old, a West Point graduate from Virginia assigned to manage medical supply distribution. Hargrove was not cruel. He was a logistician who counted things. He knew exactly how many units of blood were in the depot, how many were allocated, how many would arrive on the next transport. He was also a father whose 20-year-old son was serving in the Pacific, from whom he had not received a letter in 3 weeks. "You have 1 unit," Hargrove said, 3 patients. "One of them is German. I trust the math is straightforward, doctor." Brennan gave the blood to Whitaker, whose wound was the most survivable with the available volume. Triage, not preference. Then he turned to Sullivan. "Get me every man in this company with type O blood. We are doing direct transfusions." 2 soldiers volunteered. Their blood went into Callahan. He survived. The German prisoner remained on the 3rd stretcher, bleeding, conscious, watching everything with the wide eyes of a boy who had been told Americans tortured their prisoners and was now watching an American surgeon save 2 men while he waited to learn if the stories were true. Sullivan looked at Brennan. Brennan looked at Sullivan. She rolled up her own sleeve, sat on a crate beside the German, and extended her arm. "Type O negative, universal donor." The orderly inserted the needle, and the rubber tubing connected a nurse from Boston to a German soldier whose name they would never learn. Hargrove watched from the entrance. He said nothing. He turned and walked into the darkness. 3 men had arrived dying. 3 men left alive. Not because the system provided enough, it had not, but because the people inside it refused to let the system's limitations become their own. Sullivan, her arm bandaged, her face pale from the donation, cleaned instruments afterward. Brennan stood beside her. "You did not have to do that," he said. She did not look up. "Yes, I did," she said. "And so did you." Hargrove filed a report. A staff judge advocate noted that the Geneva Convention required wounded prisoners to receive the same standard of care. The report was shelved. But Hargrove did not forget. The battle near the Volturno River came in November 1943. The wounded arrived in waves. American soldiers first, then German prisoners. Among them was Werner Baumann, 20 years old, a Gefreiter from a small town near Munich. A baker's son drafted at 18 who had never wanted to be a soldier and had been taught that Americans tortured their prisoners. Baumann had been hit in the chest and abdomen. Both wounds survivable with proper treatment, both fatal without it. Proper treatment meant penicillin. Brennan examined Baumann under a lamp held by Sullivan. The wounds were serious, but repairable. At the entrance, Hargrove appeared for the 2nd time in Brennan's war. "That penicillin was manufactured in Brooklyn," Hargrove said. "It was paid for by American taxpayers, shipped across the Atlantic for American soldiers. You want to give it to a man who was trying to kill Americans 12 hours ago. We have had this conversation before, Colonel, and I will keep having it until someone with authority listens. Every dose given to a German prisoner is a dose unavailable for an American soldier tomorrow." Brennan stood, exhausted, hands gloved, spotted with blood from 3 different men. He looked at Hargrove and saw something that was not malice. It was math. A father's fear. The reasonable position that scarce resources should go to your own people first. Brennan understood it. He was not a saint. He had carried Jimmy Doyle for 10 months. He knew what German artillery did to American bodies. But he remembered Sullivan's arm connected by a rubber tube to a German soldier in North Africa. 3 men alive instead of 2. The day we start deciding who deserves to live, based on the uniform they wear, Brennan said, "We are not the army I signed up for." He administered the penicillin. Hargrove left without a word. He filed another report. It was shelved again. Werner Baumann woke 48 hours later. The infection was receding, the chest wound healing, the abdominal repair holding. He was alive in an American hospital. No one had tortured him. He lay in a cot next to American wounded, receiving the same care. He ate the same food. The first meal was scrambled eggs and bacon. Real bacon, thick and salty, fried in a cast iron skillet by an army cook who made no distinction between American and German breakfast trays. Baumann, who had been eating hard bread and thin soup for months, who had forgotten what animal fat tasted like, sat with the tray on his knees and ate so slowly that Sullivan came to check if something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. He was tasting every bite, memorizing it, because he could not believe it was real. He asked about the medicine. Penicillin, Sullivan told him. He was quiet for a long time. "German officers do not have this drug," he said. "You give it to a German corporal." Sullivan nodded. Baumann asked for paper and a pen. He wrote to his mother. 4 pages in German, in the careful handwriting of a baker's son taught penmanship by nuns. He described his wounds, the surgery, the hospital, the bacon. The American nurse who changed his bandages every 4 hours and smiled at him as if he were a patient rather than a prisoner. At the end, one sentence that no amount of propaganda could answer. They give their own blood to their enemies. I do not know how to write about this. That letter would take 4 months to reach Bavaria. When it arrived at a small bakery near Munich, Baumann's mother read it aloud to 3 neighbors. Those neighbors told others. Other letters from other prisoners were arriving in other towns across Germany. A quiet tide of information no ministry of propaganda could counter because it came not from enemy radio, but from German sons in their own handwriting. If the Americans treat their enemies this way, what does that say about what we have been told? The psychological consequences of the medical disparity operated on both armies, simultaneously shaping the way men fought and the way men surrendered, and the way men calculated their own odds of survival in the private arithmetic that every combat soldier performs and never speaks about. Begin with the German soldier because his psychological experience contains the most fundamental revelation. By 1943, every German frontline soldier had developed a working knowledge of the medical system available to him that was precise, unsentimental, and largely accurate. He knew that if he was wounded in the abdomen on the Eastern Front, his survival depended enormously on where the front was, what the roads were like, whether a surgeon could reach him, and whether the Feldlazaret had blood. He knew that infection was probable in deep wounds. He knew that sulfonamide helped, but did not reliably prevent gas gangrene in contaminated tissue. He carried these actuarial calculations as part of his mental equipment, and they shaped his willingness to take risks in ways that unit commanders noted, but could not easily quantify. A man who believes he will die if he is wounded fights differently from a man who believes he will be saved. Not necessarily worse, sometimes more recklessly with the fatalism of a gambler who has already calculated the house odds, sometimes more cautiously preserving himself because preservation is the only medical system available to him. But differently, the German soldier's relationship to his own body was a relationship to a resource that once damaged the state would not adequately repair. He knew this. His officers knew he knew this. And the knowledge sat in the background of every order given, and every order followed an unspoken variable in the calculus of combat. German prisoners of war captured in North Africa and subsequently treated at American medical facilities provided some of the war's most revealing commentary on this disparity. The pattern was consistent across hundreds of documented cases. Initial suspicion that American generosity was propaganda theater, followed by gradual revision as the care proved sustained and genuine. Men who had been treated with penicillin, a drug they had been told was scarce, even for German officers, wrote home with a stunned specificity that military censors found difficult to suppress. One prisoner, a Gefreiter from Bavaria, whose letter survives in translation in the National Archives, described receiving a blood transfusion as routine procedure with no explanation sought and no reciprocal obligation implied. He wrote, "They did not ask me anything. They did not demand anything. They treated me as if I were one of their own. I have been trying to understand this for 3 weeks, and I cannot. American soldiers absorbed their medical system's capabilities through channels more emotional than informational. The word passed through units in the way that all important knowledge passes through units, not through briefings or bulletins, but through the testimony of men who had been hit and returned. He got hit bad. He is already in surgery. They think he is going to make it. Said enough times in enough tents and foxholes and transport trucks, these sentences accumulated into a form of institutional trust that military psychologists later identified as a significant factor in American combat resilience. Samuel Stuffer, the sociologist, whose landmark research was published after the war, as the American soldier identified confidence in medical care as one of a small number of factors consistently correlated with positive combat performance at the unit level. Men who believed the system would take care of them if they were hit fought with a quality of commitment that on the margin translated into tactical effectiveness. It is not possible to separate this factor from the others that produced American combat performance. It is not possible to ignore it either. The strategic arithmetic of this psychological gap is invisible in the order of battle tables and the casualty statistics. It is visible in the units American and German that reached the Rhine and the Elbe in the spring of 1945, and in what remained of their fighting capacity after years of the most intensive ground combat in the history of organized warfare. The American soldier knew the system was behind him. The German soldier knew it was not. Both were right, and the knowledge shaped everything. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what happens next, what happens on a single day in June 1944, is when everything this system has built will be tested. While Baumann ate bacon in Italy, Friedrich Vogt was operating on the Eastern Front in conditions that would have been recognizable to a physician of the previous century. It was the winter of 1943. The Wehrmacht was in retreat. The Feldlazaret near Kharkov received casualties at rates it was never designed to handle. Vogt operated in the morning and through the night, by lamplight when the generator failed, with sulfonamide when he had it and nothing when he did not. Feldwebel Otto Brandt arrived on a stretcher carried by 2 soldiers who had dragged him 4 kilometers through frozen mud, 35 years old, a career soldier from Saxony, 3 years surviving on the Eastern Front, his wife at home pregnant with their 3rd child, shrapnel in his abdomen, multiple perforations, massive blood loss. Vogt looked at the wound and knew exactly what was needed, and knew exactly what he did not have. No blood. He tried warming the last unit of stored blood, which had partially frozen, by holding it against his body under his coat. It was not enough. No penicillin, no timely arrival. Brandt had waited 14 hours. Vogt operated. He always operated. He opened the abdomen with the precision of Munich, repaired the perforations with sutures any professor would have approved, lavaged with saline, and found what he knew he would find: peritoneal contamination advancing past reversibility, the surgery perfect, the patient dying. Otto Brandt died at 3 in the morning. His 3rd child would be born 4 months later into a country losing a war and a father she would never meet. Vogt sat on the floor, back against the wall, hands covered in Brandt's blood. 22 hours of operating, 6 of 10 patients lost, not to his failures, to the absence of everything behind him. He wrote in his notebook, "I performed every step correctly." The patient died. He died because he waited 14 hours. He died because I had no blood. He died because the infection had won before I opened him. The last line shattered the belief he had carried since Munich. My hands are not the system. My hands are not enough. At that same moment, General Norman Kirk, newly appointed Surgeon General, was setting a goal that Vogt would have recognized as the answer to everything he lacked: definitive surgical care within 6 to 10 hours of wounding, anywhere, any front. The American Army Medical Department deployed the 3rd component of its superiority: mobile surgical units. The Auxiliary Surgical Group, a self-contained team that could set up in a farmhouse, a barn, or a shell-damaged building and move with the fighting. The field hospital, 400 beds established in 6 hours, relocated in 12. The evacuation hospital, no patient waiting more than 4 hours for surgical triage. Each theater generating after-action reports that fed back into doctrine in real time. The system was self-correcting. German field surgery relied on fixed facilities that struggled when the front moved. Moving a failed lazaret meant suspending surgery. During that gap, wounded men found no surgeon. American wounded in France from June 1944 onward reached surgical care in 4 to 6 hours. German wounded on the Eastern Front averaged 12. In winter, with roads destroyed, the wait was measured in days. The difference is the difference between a wound a surgeon can repair and one that has already killed the man who carries it. June the 5th, 1944. The hold of a transport ship. Thomas Brennan sat on a wooden crate and inventoried what he had been given. In his medical kit, dressings, morphine, sulfonamide, a tourniquet, a card listing his blood type. Behind him on the ship's field, hospitals in numbered crates, refrigerated blood, penicillin, operating tables, generators. 47,000 physicians and 57,000 nurses in uniform. Brennan closed his eyes. He thought about Jimmy Doyle, about the night in North Africa with 3 dying men and 1 bottle, about Sullivan's arm connected to a German stranger, about Hargrove in the doorway, not wrong about the math, wrong about what the math should mean. He opened his eyes. He was calculating capacity. How many tables in 6 hours? How many units of blood before resupply? He was thinking like a system. Jimmy Doyle had taught him that. Across the channel, Friedrich Vogt was making his own preparations. Transferred from the Eastern Front to France in early 1944, he had inventoried his resources with the same precision: sulfonamide adequate, bandages adequate, instruments adequate, plasma limited, blood dependent on donors at point of need, penicillin 0. 3 requests, 3 acknowledgments, 0 deliveries. For the ordinary German soldier about to be wounded on the beaches, the medical reality was if everything went right, if he reached a surgeon, if the surgery succeeded, he would face the infection alone. Vogt prepared, he organized, he waited. The sound came at 0630 on the morning of June 6, 1944. 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the channel and landed on 5 beaches. Casualties began arriving at American facilities within hours. The system activated. Medics on the beach applied first aid under fire. Aid stations triaged. Ambulances moved wounded to clearing stations. From there to field hospitals in Norman farmhouses and damaged buildings. Brennan's hospital was operational by afternoon. He came ashore with the second wave and established the facility in a stone farmhouse whose French owners had fled, leaving a kitchen that smelled of bread and a barn that became the operating theater. Portable table under electric light, sterile instruments laid out by Sullivan. On the shelf behind him, rows of whole blood and penicillin. The first casualties to reach Brennan's detail came from Omaha Beach, the stretch of sand between Vierville and Colville that would produce the highest American losses of the day. The men who arrived had waded through water that turned red before they reached the sand. They had crawled across a beach swept by machine gun fire from fortified positions that the preliminary bombardment had failed to destroy. They had lain in the open bleeding, waiting for a medic who was himself under fire and working through his supplies faster than any training exercise had anticipated. The medics on Omaha Beach performed a form of medicine that no hospital and no field manual could fully prepare a man for. They crawled to wounded soldiers under fire. They applied tourniquets with hands that shook, not from fear. Though fear was present, but from the adrenaline that turns fine motor control into something coarser and less reliable. They injected morphine from syrettes that they activated by crushing the wire seal with their teeth because their hands were occupied holding pressure on a wound. They sprinkled sulfonamide powder into open abdominal cavities on a beach in the wind, with sand blowing into the wound, knowing that contamination was inevitable, and that the powder was the only barrier between the patient and the infection that would begin within hours. Then they loaded the wounded onto stretchers and carried them or dragged them to collection points at the edge of the beach where the evacuation chain began its work. Brennan's first patient from the beach was a sergeant from Pennsylvania, 26 years old, who had been hit in the lower abdomen and both legs by a burst of machine gun fire while crossing the tidal flat. The medic who delivered him had written on a tag attached to the sergeant's collar abdomen, both legs morphine ×2 tourniquet left thigh P unknown. The blood pressure was unknown because taking blood pressure on an open beach under machine gun fire was not possible. The medic had estimated by pulse and skin color. gray and thready, which meant bad. Brennan cut away the uniform. The abdominal wound was severe but contained. The left leg was shattered below the knee. The right leg had a through-and-through wound to the calf that had missed the major vessels. He made the decision in seconds. Abdomen first, leg second, blood now. Sullivan hung the blood while Brennan opened the abdomen. The bottle swayed on its stand each time a shell landed within a quarter mile, which was frequently because the naval bombardment offshore had not stopped, and the German artillery inland had not been silenced. Brennan worked inside the abdominal cavity by electric light that flickered when the generator surged, finding perforations, repairing them, lavaging with warm saline, working with the focused speed of a man who had learned in North Africa that time was the one thing they would not give him. The sergeant survived. He would lose the left leg below the knee. He would keep the right. He would go home to Pennsylvania and run a hardware store for 40 years and walk with a prosthetic that he covered with a trouser leg and never discussed. The third patient was a private from Texas, 19 years old, who had been hit in the chest by shrapnel. The fragment had entered below the right clavicle and lodged near the spine. Chest wounds were among the most time-sensitive injuries in combat surgery. The lung was collapsing. Air was accumulating in the pleural space, compressing the heart. Brennan inserted a chest tube to release the pressure, a procedure that took less than a minute and that performed 6 hours after wounding instead of 20, was the difference between a recoverable injury and a fatal one. The private from Texas survived. He was 19. He would go home and become a high school football coach and never tell his players about the scar under his collarbone. Between the sixth and the ninth patients, Brennan operated in a kind of trance that he would later describe to his medical students as the state in which surgical training takes over from conscious thought. His hands moved. His eyes assessed. His voice called for instruments and sutures and blood in a rhythm that Sullivan matched without being told because she had worked beside him long enough to anticipate what he would need before he asked for it. They did not speak except in the shorthand of surgery: clamp, suture, blood, more light. They were two people functioning as one unit inside a larger system, and the system was holding. Outside the farmhouse, the war continued. Trucks brought wounded through lanes so narrow that the drivers had to fold in their mirrors to pass. Ambulances lined up in the farmyard. Stretcher bearers moved between vehicles and the barn door in a continuous stream. The sounds were engines and artillery and the occasional sharp crack of a rifle, and beneath all of it, the sound that every military surgeon learns to hear through walls and across distances, the sound of a man in pain trying not to scream because he has been taught that screaming is weakness, and because the morphine has worn off, and because no one has reached him yet with more. On the German side of the battlefield that night, Friedrich Vogt worked in conditions that were a grotesque mirror of Brennan's experience. The same urgency, the same exhaustion, the same unending stream of broken bodies, but without the system. Vogt's operating room was the cellar of a Norman farmhouse that had taken a direct hit from a naval shell. Half the ceiling was gone. Dust and plaster fell into the surgical field continuously. He had rigged a canvas sheet above the operating table to keep debris out of open wounds, but the sheet sagged under the weight of accumulated dust and had to be emptied every hour. His fourth patient was a Gefreiter from Saxony, 21 years old, with a wound almost identical to Brennan's sergeant from Pennsylvania. Abdomen, both legs. The difference was that this boy had waited 18 hours. He had lain in a ditch beside a road that was under air attack, waiting for a stretcher team that was carrying other wounded, waiting for transport, that had been destroyed, waiting for a medical system that was breaking apart under the weight of the Allied assault. By the time he reached Vogt's table, the peritoneal infection was advanced. The abdomen was hot and distended. The smell of anaerobic bacteria was present before Vogt made the incision. He opened the wound and found what he had found so many times before: contamination beyond the point where surgery could reverse it. He operated anyway. He repaired what could be repaired. He cleaned what could be cleaned. He administered sulfonamide. He did not have penicillin. He did not have blood. The boy died 4 hours later, conscious for most of it, asking for water that Vogt could not give him because fluid in a perforated bowel would accelerate the infection. Vogt recorded the death in his surgical log, the 23rd preventable death he had documented since Stalingrad. He did not write a note in the margin. There was nothing left to write that he had not already written. The system had failed. It had always failed. And the men on his table had paid for it with their lives. In 18 hours between the afternoon of June 6th and the morning of June 7th, Thomas Brennan performed 11 abdominal surgeries. Each patient had penetrating wounds to the gut, injuries that carried 90% mortality in the Civil War, 66% in the First World War. 9 of 11 survived. The first patient was a 20-year-old private from Ohio. Brennan hung the blood himself. The boy's color changed within minutes. Gray receded, pulse strengthened, and Brennan, hands inside the abdominal cavity repairing perforations, worked with the knowledge that for the first time since Jimmy Doyle, he had everything he needed: the skill and the system. Sullivan worked beside him for the full 18 hours. At hour 14, her hands trembled. She paused 10 seconds, closed her eyes, breathed, opened them, continued. Neither spoke. That night, Sullivan sat outside on an overturned ammunition crate and wrote to her younger sister Katie in Boston by lantern light in handwriting that shook from exhaustion. "The system works, Katie. A boy gets hit, and he is on the table in 4 hours. He has blood. He has penicillin. He has a surgeon who can work because the tools are there. It is not a miracle. It is logistics. Logistics in a country that decided every boy is worth the trouble." I held retractors for 18 hours. My hands are still shaking. But 9 boys are alive who would not have been alive in the last war. I will never forget that number. I will also never forget the 2. She folded the letter, placed it in the mail pouch, and went back inside to check on the 9 men whose blood pressure she would monitor through the night. On the other side of those beaches, Friedrich Vogt was performing the same surgery with the same skill. German wounded arrived, carried by stretcher bearers navigating cratered roads under strafing. Vehicles that should have moved wounded were burning in ditches. Supply trucks had been targeted. They carried no markings distinguishable from ammunition transports at 10,000 feet. Vogt's patients arrived late. 14 hours. 18. 20. Bacteria had colonized the wounds. Blood loss had exceeded compensation. The margins of survivability had closed. Vogt operated. He always operated. 11 abdominal surgeries in the same 18 hours. Technique as precise. Training as thorough. Determination more desperate because he knew before the first incision what the outcome would be for most. 4 survived. 7 died. The distance between 9 and 4 is not measured in surgical talent. It is measured in the system behind those hands, in the blood that was there or was not, in the drug that was available or was not, in the hours between wounding and surgery that were 4 or were 20, in the accumulated decisions of a democratic state about the value of the ordinary soldier's life. Vogt did not know Brennan's name on June 6th. He knew only what he had always known, that his hands were not enough. 9 months later, the lie and the war ended together. March 1945. The Rhine. The Wehrmacht collapsing. Near Remagen, where American forces captured a bridge intact, Vogt's unit was overrun. He surrendered alongside his wounded in a destroyed school basement. Because of shrapnel in his left shoulder, he was transferred to an American field hospital. He walked in on a March afternoon wearing his German medical officer's uniform, left arm in a sling. He was expecting efficiency. The hospital was a converted warehouse, heated, lit by electric lights. Rows of cots, American and German wounded alike, each with a chart. Nurses moving between beds with a calm that spoke of routine. The smell of antiseptic clean and sharp, a smell Vogt had not associated with a military facility in 3 years. And on the shelves along the back wall, in rows so neat they might have been arranged for a photograph, glass bottles of whole blood organized by type and date. Next to them, vials of penicillin, hundreds, available for privates, available for prisoners. Vogt stopped walking. He stood surrounded by everything he had lacked for 4 years and could not move. He thought about Karl Hessler, 18 years old, gas gangrene, 12 days dying because there was no penicillin. He thought about Willie Pelzer, 20 years old, Christmas Eve, no blood. He thought about Otto Brandt, 35, 14 hours, perfect surgery, dead anyway. He thought about every name in his notebook, every surgery performed correctly on a patient who died, every time he had been told to adapt. A voice behind him, American accent, tired but steady. "Let me take a look at that shoulder." Vogt turned. The American surgeon was approximately his age, lean, dark circles under his eyes. Surgical apron over uniform. Name stitched above the pocket. Brennan. Brennan cleaned the wound, applied sulfonamide, administered penicillin. Vogt watched the drug enter his arm and thought about Otto Brandt dead because this exact drug had not existed in his world. "How many of these do you have?" Vogt asked. Brennan looked at him. "Enough." Silence. Then Vogt spoke in the voice of a man containing something that would otherwise overwhelm him. "I lost a man named Brandt. Winter of 1943. Abdominal wound. Survivable. 14 hours. No blood. No penicillin. Perfect surgery. He died." Brennan stopped. He looked at the German. In his eyes, he saw something he recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror for 2 years. The anguish of a physician who did everything right and lost the patient anyway. "I lost a man named Doyle," Brennan said. "North Africa, 1943. Same wound, same story. No blood. Died on my table. 2 surgeons, 2 countries, 2 identical losses separated by everything that happened afterward. It was not the surgeons," Vogt said. "It was never the surgeons." "No," Brennan said. "It was everything behind us. They did not become friends. Vogt was a prisoner. Brennan his physician. But in 7 months of American custody, Vogt observed, asked questions, took notes in a notebook that mixed German and English. Colonel Hargrove was also at the facility. He saw Brennan treating Vogt, saw penicillin administered to a German officer without hesitation. He stood in the corridor for a long time watching. Then he walked away. He did not file a report. Perhaps by March 1945, the math had changed. Or perhaps after 3 years of watching Brennan and Sullivan treat every man regardless of uniform, Hargrove had arrived at a conclusion his arithmetic had not previously allowed. That the cost of mercy was real, but the cost of refusing it was greater. His son came home from the Pacific in September 1945, alive, uninjured. Hargrove never mentioned the reports he had filed. In a moment, I'm going to tell you what happened to each of these people. But first, if this story has meant something to you, please subscribe and share this video. Because the men and women who built this system never got a memorial. This is the closest thing to one. The survival statistics produced by American military medicine are among the most significant data in the history of trauma surgery. They deserve to be heard slowly because each number represents men who lived instead of dying. The case fatality rate fell from 8% in the First World War to 4.5% in the Second. Modest sounding until you account for the fact that Second World War weapons produced dramatically worse wounds. The injuries were more severe. The outcomes were better. Abdominal wounds carried 90% mortality in the Civil War, 66% in the First World War, 24% in the Second under American care. Wound infections fell from 15% to below 2%. The Red Cross collected 13.3 million pints. By 1945, air evacuation moved 100,000 casualties monthly in the Pacific alone. Return-to-duty rates ran at 50 to 60%, recycling experienced soldiers back into units and at a rate Germany could not match. The reverberations of American military medicine extended beyond the battlefield and into the fabric of American life in ways that shaped both the immediate social contract between the state and its citizens and the long-term development of healthcare in the United States. The surgeons and nurses who returned from overseas brought with them skills in trauma surgery, anesthesiology, and the management of shock that were in some cases a decade ahead of what American civilian hospitals had been practicing in 1941. A surgeon who had spent 2 years operating in field hospitals under fire, making life and death decisions in seconds, managing multiple casualties, simultaneously working with blood products and antibiotics, in combinations that civilian medicine had not yet adopted, came home to a civilian hospital system that seemed by comparison almost leisurely in its pace. These men and women did not simply resume their peacetime careers. They transformed them. They brought the war's lessons into operating rooms, in emergency departments, in medical schools across the country, and the standard of American trauma care rose accordingly. The understanding of blood banking, developed in military depots, was transferred to civilian hospital systems in the years immediately following the war. Before the war, blood transfusion in civilian hospitals was an occasional procedure performed under carefully controlled conditions. After the war, it became a standard capability available in every hospital of significant size, because the physicians who had managed blood supplies under combat conditions understood both the logistics and the life-saving potential in ways their civilian colleagues did not. The blood bank, once a military innovation, became a fixture of American medicine. The Veterans Administration hospital system expanded dramatically after the war to meet the medical needs of returning veterans. It became one of the largest medical research and training institutions in the world, channeling the clinical experience of military medicine into the education of the next generation of American physicians. Young doctors who trained in VA hospitals in the late 1940s and 1950s learned from surgeons who had operated at Anzio in Normandy and Okinawa, and they carried those lessons into the civilian practices they established in cities and towns across the country. The Hill-Burton Act of 1946, officially the Hospital Survey and Construction Act, funded the building of hospitals across the United States. It was explicitly framed as an extension of the medical care the government owed its veterans. The logic was straightforward and deeply American. If the state had invested the full weight of its industrial and scientific capacity in keeping soldiers alive during the war, it could not in good conscience abandon their medical needs when the war ended. By 1975, the Hill-Burton Act had added over 4,000 new medical facilities to the American healthcare landscape, many of them in rural areas and small towns that had never had a hospital before. A farmer in Mississippi who had never worn a uniform benefited from a hospital that existed because the government had decided that the men who had worn uniforms deserved one. The experience of managing combat psychiatric casualties under forward treatment doctrine influenced the development of community mental health services in the 1950s and 1960s. The PIE principle, proximity, immediacy, and expectancy, developed by psychiatrists working with the Eighth Army in North Africa, held that combat exhaustion treated immediately near the front with rest food and the expectation of return to duty resolved in the majority of cases within 72 hours. This insight that psychiatric crisis responded better to immediate community-based intervention than to long-term institutional care became one of the intellectual foundations of the community mental health movement that would reshape American psychiatry in the following decades. Germany's medical reconstruction was slower and carried the weight of additional burdens. The loss of a generation of physicians to combat left gaps that took years to fill. The moral catastrophe of the regime the medical profession had served, including the experiments conducted at concentration camps by physicians whose actions corrupted the institutional culture of German medicine, required a reckoning that complicated the process of rebuilding. German pharmaceutical and surgical research recovered its international standing by the 1960s, but it rebuilt toward a different future than the one the wartime medical service had been trying to serve. Werner Baumann returned to his mother's bakery near Munich after the war. He took over the business when his mother grew too old to work the ovens. He married a local woman named Brigitte. He had 4 children. He never spoke about the war in detail, but he kept the letter he had written from the American hospital, the original draft in his own handwriting, in a drawer beside his bed for the rest of his life. When his eldest son asked about it years later, Baumann said, "Only I wrote it when I was 20 years old, and I was sure I was going to die. And then I did not die. Because of them." He lived to be 81. He died in 2005 in a hospital in Munich that had a blood bank and penicillin and an emergency department modeled on the American trauma system. He did not know that the system that treated him in his final illness was descended through Friedrich Volk's work and the work of others like him from the same system that had saved his life 62 years earlier in a tent in Italy. American families who had sent sons into combat in 1943 and 1944 were increasingly families who had received the information through Army communications, through war correspondence, through letters that the medical system was real and functioning. A mother in Ohio who had watched her brother die of wound infection in a French hospital in 1918 was sending her son into a different medical reality in 1944. She might not have articulated the difference in technical terms. She felt it in the letters her son sent home, letters in which the wounded buddy had been operated on within hours, in which the penicillin had worked, in which the blood transfusion had happened as standard procedure. This was the implicit promise of the American state at its most functional. We will ask extraordinary things of your family. In return, we will protect them with every industrial and scientific capacity we can bring to bear. The blood bank was the intimate version of this promise, the one that operated in the hours between wounding and dawn, in the hands of a surgeon in a tent administered to a 20-year-old who had not yet begun his adult life. Each percentage point represents children born of families made lives lived because someone drove a refrigerated truck through the night or worked a double shift in a Brooklyn laboratory or rolled up a sleeve on a Tuesday morning in Ohio. Thomas Brennan went home to Philadelphia in 1946. He returned to Jefferson Medical College and became a professor of trauma surgery. He taught for 31 years. Every September, he gave the same opening lecture to the new class. He stood at the front of the auditorium, lean gray at the temples, steady hands, and told them about Jimmy Doyle, about a 19-year-old from Brooklyn who died because the surgeon had the skill, but not the system. And then the sentence that became the foundation of everything he taught. Your job is to make sure you have both, the skill and the system, because one without the other will kill the patients you are trying to save. Margaret Sullivan went home to Boston in 1945. She completed her nursing degree at Boston College and spent 30 years as a surgical nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital. She never told anyone about the night in North Africa when she opened her own vein for a German prisoner. When her niece Katie's daughter asked what the war had been like, Sullivan thought for a long time and said, "Only I learned that the most important thing in medicine is not what you know. It is what you have and who you are willing to use it for." Earl Whitaker went home to Tupelo in June 1944. He married Clara, built furniture, raised 3 children, never spoke about the war in detail, never told his children about the night at Anzio when mortar rounds shook the table and a surgeon worked by the light of a single lantern, never knew the name of the woman whose blood saved his life, kept his uniform in a trunk in the attic. When his children asked about the scar, he said only that he had been lucky. He died in 1987, 65 years old. A good life. A full life. A life that existed because a system had decided he was worth saving. Friedrich Vogt returned to Munich in 1946 carrying a notebook full of observations. He joined the medical faculty at the University of Munich and spent 4 decades building what he had seen. He established blood banking protocols modeled on the American Army blood program. He trained a generation of German trauma surgeons. He published papers citing the American tiered evacuation model as the standard. In 1989 at 77, Vogt sat at his desk in Munich and wrote a letter, not to any individual, to a country, in English. He gave it to his daughter with instructions to send copies to 2 places: the archive at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, and the Veterans Administration Office in Tupelo, Mississippi, with a request that it be forwarded to surviving family of servicemen treated at Anzio in February 1944. I was trained to believe that a surgeon's hands were enough. The war taught me they were not. I lost men who should have lived. Not because I failed them as a surgeon, because my country failed to build what your country built. A blood supply that reached the front, a drug that reached the wounded, a way to move a dying man to a surgeon before it was too late. I spent my life after the war trying to build what I saw in your field hospitals. I do not know if I succeeded. I know that I tried, and I know that every patient I saved after 1946 I saved with the lessons your system taught me. The Walter Reed copy was filed with the archive. The VA copy was forwarded through clerks and researchers who matched dates and unit records and sent it to the last known address of the family of Private First Class Earl Whitaker. It arrived in Tupelo in the spring of 1993, years after Whitaker's death. His wife Clara placed it in the trunk with his uniform, and there it remained. In 2019, a retired school teacher in Tupelo was clearing her late grandfather's house for sale. Earl Whitaker had been dead 32 years, Clara since 2003. In the bottom of the trunk in the attic beneath the folded uniform and the photograph from Italy, the school teacher found an envelope she had never seen. Postmarks from Germany, Washington, Memphis, dated 1989. Inside a single sheet in English in a hand she did not recognize. It began, "To the nation that showed me what medicine could be." She did not know who had written it. She did not know Friedrich Vogt. She knew only that her grandfather had survived a wound at Anzio, come home married. Clara built furniture, raised 3 children, one of whom was her mother. She sat on the floor of the attic with the letter in her hands and read it twice. Then she folded it back into the envelope and held it against her chest for a long time in the silence of a house full of the ordinary things a man accumulates over a lifetime. The furniture he built, the photographs he kept, the grandchildren he held. All of it made possible by a bottle of blood that crossed an ocean and arrived at the right table at the right moment in a tent on an Italian beachhead at 3:40 in the morning on a night in February 1944. History remembers the generals. It remembers the battles and the turning points and the decisions made in command posts and war rooms. It does not easily remember the refrigerated truck driving through the night in Sicily with a cargo of whole blood, or the microbiologist at Pfizer working a second shift in Brooklyn on the deep tank fermentation problem, adjusting the aeration rate one more time because the culture had contaminated again and the wounded were not going to wait. Or the Red Cross volunteer in Cincinnati who rolled up her sleeve on a Tuesday morning and gave a pint of blood to a stranger she would never meet. Or the nurse who held retractors for 18 hours and trembled at hour 14 and took a breath and continued. Or the surgeon who wrote in his notebook the sentence that became the foundation of everything he taught for the next 30 years. They are the ones who won this particular battle. The battle no one names, the one fought in tents and aid stations and mobile surgical units against hemorrhagic shock and anaerobic bacteria and the arithmetic of the golden hour. They won it quietly, systematically, and completely. And the men who came home because of them, the men who married and built and raised children and grew old in a country that had invested in their survival, those men are the memorial. Every one of them, every child they raised, every life that their living made possible. That is the legacy of American military medicine. That is the battle no one named, and it was won.